At 4 in the morning, I saw my wife secretly driving off in my truck. I followed her from a distance. I could barely breathe as I watched her drag a heavy sack and throw it into the dark lake. Unable to believe my eyes, I quickly called for help. When they pulled the sack out of the water, what emerged froze me to the core. If you are just tuning in, take a deep breath, because the betrayal I uncovered that night will leave you completely speechless. This is not just a story about losing money. It is a story about losing everything you believed in. I am 73 years old. I built a massive logistics empire from the ground up, starting in Texas with nothing but a rusty toolbox and a refusal to fail. That empire afforded me a sprawling estate, successful businesses, and what I thought was a loving wife named Diane. But extreme wealth makes you a target, sometimes to the very people sleeping right next to you. The rough rumble of my old Ford truck broke the silence. That truck has been with me for 40 years. It was the first vehicle I ever bought for my business, smelling of engine oil, sweat, and hard work. And I keep it in the garage as a silent reminder of where I came from. No one is allowed to drive it, especially not Diane. I looked out the window and saw the heavy truck fading down our long driveway. I threw a coat over my pajamas, grabbed my keys, and hurried out to my electric sedan. I kept my distance, tracking the familiar red glow of the Ford taillights as they snaked down the empty, winding country roads toward the shores of Lake Travis. The Texas night was pitch black and biting cold. What I saw made my blood run cold. Diane, my elegant wife, was struggling with a heavy canvas sack. Under the pale moonlight, I saw dark, wet stains seeping through the thick fabric. It looked exactly like blood. She swung the heavy sack, and it plunged into the black water. She stood there for the moment, wiping her gloved hands on her coat before driving away. I pressed myself against an oak tree, my heart hammering against my ribs. A body. Had my wife killed someone? My mind raced through 1,000 terrifying possibilities, but I did not step out of the shadows. You do not survive in my cutthroat industry by showing your hand prematurely. Instead, I dialed Sheriff Thompson directly on his personal line. I had funded his re-election campaign, and I knew he would handle this delicate situation quietly. Within 20 minutes, long after Diane had vanished, Thompson arrived with 2 highly trusted deputies. I stood on the edge of the lake as the deputies tossed grappling hooks into the dark water. It took them 3 tries before they hooked the heavy canvas. The electric winch whined loudly in the silent night, straining under the immense weight, until the soaking wet sack finally breached the surface of the water. They dragged it onto the muddy bank. The dark stains were undeniable. I braced myself for the horrifying sight of a human being. Sheriff Thompson pulled out his pocket knife and sliced the thick nylon ropes binding the top. He pulled the canvas back, and the beam of his heavy flashlight hit the contents. I blinked, completely confused. It was not a body. It was metal. It was my personal biometric safe from my private locked study. It was made of reinforced steel, but the heavy hinges had been brutally sawed apart. The dark stains were not blood, but a mixture of thick red hydraulic fluid from an industrial saw and the heavy grease she must have used to muffle the noise. Thompson pried the ruined steel door open. The jagged cuts had let the murky lake water seep inside. Resting inside were the original irreplaceable trust documents for a $15 million charity fund I had established. Floating near the top of the ruined safe was what caught my eye. The dirty water had curled its edges, but the image itself was crystal clear under the flashlight. It was a thick, glossy photograph. It was a picture of 3 people standing on a sun-drenched tropical beach, smiling brightly at the camera, holding up vacation cocktails. The first person was Diane. The second person was Derek, my 42-year-old son. And the third person standing between them was Rachel. Rachel, my son-wife. The woman who supposedly died of a rare aggressive cancer exactly 5 years ago. I had paid over $2 million in medical bills for her experimental treatments. I had stood by her hospital bed and wept like a child, completely shattered by the unfairness of life. I had paid for her funeral, picked out her expensive casket, and watched them lower it deep into the cold ground. Yet here she was, smiling, tanned, and very much alive. I stared at the photograph until my vision blurred. The betrayal was so massive, so incomprehensible, that for a long moment, I literally forgot how to breathe. They had played me, my own flesh and blood, my wife, and the woman I treated like my own daughter. They had orchestrated an elaborate, incredibly cruel lie to drain me of my wealth. Sheriff Thompson asked me if I was all right, his voice sounding like it was coming from 100 miles away. I did not answer him. I just stared at the smiling faces of the people I loved, realizing they were the faces of monsters. The cold wind howling across Lake Travis was nothing compared to the absolute ice that settled into my soul at that very moment. I folded the wet photograph, slipped it into my coat pocket, and promised myself one thing. I was going to destroy them all. The ride to the local precinct was a blur of flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the dark Texas pavement. I sat in the passenger seat of Sheriff Thompson Cruiser, the heater blasting against my numb legs, but I could not feel the warmth. My mind was locked on the folded, damp photograph burning a hole in my coat pocket. By the time we pulled into the concrete parking lot of the station, the sky was just beginning to bleed a dull, bruised purple. The deputies had already brought Diane in. I walked through the heavy glass doors, my posture straight, projecting the image of a concerned husband rather than a man who had just discovered a nest of vipers in his own home. They had placed her in a standard interview room at the end of the hall. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting pale shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. I stood behind the two-way mirror for a long moment, simply watching the woman I had shared a bed with for the past decade. She sat huddled in a metal chair, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders, looking small and fragile. It was a brilliant image. If I had not seen her casually heave a 100-pound steel safe into a lake just an hour earlier, I might have felt sorry for her. Sheriff Thompson placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and asked if I was ready to speak with her. I nodded, keeping my facial expression carefully neutral. Thompson opened the heavy metal door, and we stepped inside. Diane looked up, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She immediately reached her hands out across the table, whispering my name in a voice that trembled with perfect, calibrated fear. I did not take her hands. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the damp photograph, and placed it flat on the cold metal table right in front of her. I asked her, in a low, even tone, to explain why my dead daughter-in-law was smiling on a beach with my son and my wife. For a fraction of a second, just one microscopic moment, I saw the genuine panic flash behind her eyes. The mask slipped, her pupils dilated, and her breath caught in her throat. But Diane was a survivor, a chameleon who had climbed her way into high society through sheer manipulative willpower. The panic vanished, instantly replaced by the most masterful performance I have ever witnessed in my 73 years on this earth. Her lower lip began to quiver. A single tear spilled over her cheek, followed by a sudden, violent sob that seemed to tear through her entire body. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. She wept with such raw, devastating agony that Sheriff Thompson physically shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable and sympathetic. Between her breathless sobs, the lie poured out, smooth and perfectly structured. She looked up at Thompson, tears streaming down her face, and pointed a shaking finger at the photograph. She cried out that the picture was not real. She swore on her life that she had never been to that beach, that she had not seen Rachel since the funeral. It is a fake, she wailed, her voice cracking with desperation. A deep fake! She told the room that for the past 3 weeks, she had been receiving anonymous, untraceable text messages from a group of sophisticated extortionists. According to her brilliant narrative, these criminals had used advanced artificial intelligence to generate this highly realistic image of the 3 of them together. Why would they do that? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat, playing the role of the confused, aging husband. Diane gasped for air, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She turned her tear-streaked face toward me, her expression radiating absolute devotion. Because of the company, she sobbed. Because of the initial public offering. The logistics empire I had built was scheduled to go public on the stock exchange in less than a month. A massive financial milestone that would bring in hundreds of millions of dollars. She claimed the extortionists threatened to leak this fabricated photograph to the press. They told her that a scandal suggesting my family faked a death would tank the stock price, scare off institutional investors, and ruin my life's work. She reached out and grabbed my wrist, her fingernails digging into my skin. I did not want them to destroy everything you built, she cried, her voice echoing in the small concrete room. She confessed to hiring a private locksmith to break the biometric seal on the safe. She claimed the blackmailers demanded the original trust documents as collateral to ensure we would pay the ransom. The secret drop-off was supposed to be at the lake, but when no one showed up, she panicked. She said she threw the safe into the water to destroy the evidence. She wept uncontrollably, desperately begging me to forgive her for trying to handle this massive burden completely alone without my help. She claimed she just wanted to protect my aging heart from the unbearable stress and public humiliation of a corporate scandal. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Sheriff Thompson. He was nodding his head in complete agreement. The police department had recently attended a seminar on the threat of artificial intelligence and deepfake blackmail schemes targeting wealthy business owners. Her lie fit perfectly into the modern narrative of cybercrime. Thompson placed a comforting hand on Diane's shoulder, assuring her that she was a victim. He promised her they would bring the cyber division in to track down these extortionists. They bought it. Every single word of her fabricated story. As I stood there in that sterile interrogation room, listening to the men console my wife, a sickening realization washed over me. She was actually winning this very first battle of our war. I stepped forward and did the hardest thing I have ever had to do. I embraced the woman actively trying to destroy me. I stroked her hair, letting her cry against my chest, and whispered words of reassurance. I told her everything was going to be all right, that I understood why she kept it a secret, and that we would face these criminals together. Sheriff Thompson smiled, visibly relieved that the crisis had been averted. I walked to the front desk, signed the release paperwork, and bailed my wife out of police custody. I shook the sheriff's hand, thanked him for his discretion, and guided Diane out of the cold police station and into the freezing morning. The sky turned pale gray as we walked across the asphalt to my car. I opened the passenger door for her, playing the role of the forgiving husband perfectly. She slid into the leather seat, exhausted from her performance, and closed her eyes. I walked around to the driver's side, got in, and started the electric engine. The drive back to our estate was agonizingly quiet. The only sound was the hum of the tires against the pavement, and Diane's occasional, carefully timed sniffles. She leaned her head against the window, pretending to be utterly drained. But sitting just 2 feet away from her, my gut feeling was screaming at a deafening volume. My instincts, the same instincts that helped me build a logistics empire from scratch, were clawing at the inside of my chest. I knew she was lying. Her story was too perfect, neatly wrapped in the modern paranoia of artificial intelligence. It was a brilliant defense, but my mind could not let go of that photograph. The image was burned into my retinas. The way Rachel smiled, the specific angle of the sunlight hitting their faces, the sheer humanity captured in that frame. It did not feel like a generated image. It felt like a real memory. A memory I was deliberately excluded from. We pulled up to the heavy iron gates of our estate, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon. I parked the car in the garage, right next to the empty space where my truck usually sat. Diane unbuckled her seatbelt and offered me a weak, grateful smile. She thanked me again for believing her, her voice barely a whisper. I told her to go upstairs, take a warm shower, and try to get some sleep. I watched her walk through the door leading to the kitchen, her shoulders slumped in a performance of perfect vulnerability. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, the facade dropped from my face. My hands, steady for the past 2 hours, began to shake with barely suppressed rage. I walked into my private study, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and turned on the desk lamp. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the photograph. The drive home and the warmth of my pocket had dried the thick, glossy paper. The water stains had warped the edges slightly, but the center of the image was perfectly intact. I sat down in my leather armchair, pulled my reading glasses from my pocket, and stared at the picture. I needed to find a flaw. I needed to find the one detail her brilliant, manipulative mind had overlooked. I scanned the background, looking for mismatched shadows or distorted foliage. I examined their faces, searching for unnatural smoothness that often gives away deepfakes. Everything looked flawless. The lighting was natural. The ocean waves crashed with realistic white foam, and their expressions were genuinely joyous. But then my eyes drifted down from their smiling faces to their bodies. I looked at Rachel, noticing the subtle tan lines on her shoulders. I looked at Diane, noting the sunglasses resting on her head. And then I looked at my son. Derek stood with his left arm draped casually around Rachel's waist. The sleeve of his linen shirt was rolled up, exposing his wrist to the bright tropical sun. I leaned closer to the photograph, my breath catching in my throat. I opened the top drawer of my desk, took out a magnifying glass, and held it over the image. The polished glass magnified Derek's wrist, bringing a single object into sharp focus. It was a watch. A very specific, highly distinctive timepiece. It was a Patek Philippe Grand Complications, featuring a rare rose gold casing and a custom midnight blue dial. I stared at the tiny mechanical details captured in the photograph, and a shockwave of absolute clarity hit me. Just last week, we celebrated Derek's 42nd birthday at an exclusive steakhouse downtown. At the end of the meal, I handed him a heavy wooden box. Inside that box was that exact rose gold watch. It was a custom order, a limited edition piece I commissioned from Switzerland months in advance. No one else had that exact configuration. More importantly, Derek did not own that watch until 7 days ago. Extortionists could not have generated an image of Derek wearing a custom watch he had not even received yet. Artificial intelligence is powerful, but it cannot predict the future. It cannot magically know what birthday gift a father will give his son. The picture was not a deepfake. It was a real photograph, taken within the last 7 days, on a tropical beach thousands of miles away. My heart pounded against my ribs. The truth was staring me right in the face, completely undeniable and utterly devastating. The cancer had not killed my daughter-in-law. Rachel was alive. My son knew she was alive. My wife knew she was alive. They had all been standing on that beach, laughing at the old man who wept at an empty grave. I slowly lowered the magnifying glass, the cold reality settling deep into my bones. The grief I had carried for 5 years evaporated, instantly replaced by a calculating fury. I sat in the heavy silence of my study, letting the icy realization harden my resolve. For 5 long years, I had mourned a ghost. I had visited a grave that was nothing but a prop in a sick, twisted play directed by my own flesh and blood. They thought I was just a tired, gullible old man who would blindly sign away his fortune out of misplaced guilt and sorrow. They forgot who I was. They forgot the ruthless, uncompromising businessman who had crushed every competitor in the Texas logistics market. I did not build an empire by playing the victim, and I certainly was not going to start right now. The rules of engagement had just changed. I was no longer the mourning father or the betrayed husband. I was the hunter, and they were trespassing on my territory. I listened closely to the ambient sounds of the massive estate. Faintly, through the thick walls, I heard the rhythmic drumming of water hitting the marble tiles in the master bathroom upstairs. Diane was taking her shower. She was washing away the lake water, the hydraulic fluid, and the fake tears, probably congratulating herself on a flawless performance at the police station. She thought she had me completely fooled. I needed to move fast. Her showers never lasted longer than 20 minutes, which meant I had a very narrow window to establish a secure line of communication and a surveillance system she knew nothing about. I stood up from my heavy leather chair and walked over to the towering mahogany bookshelf lining the far wall of my study. My hands were no longer shaking. The adrenaline had completely stabilized my nervous system, sharpening my focus to a razor edge. I reached up to the third shelf and pulled out a hollowed-out copy of a classic novel I had kept since my early days in business. Inside the faux velvet interior rested a cheap, prepaid cellular phone. A burner phone. In my industry, corporate espionage was a very real threat, and I always kept an unregistered device hidden for extreme emergencies. I had charged the battery weeks ago, just out of habit. I pressed the power button, and the small screen glowed to life, displaying full signal strength. This plastic device was going to be my lifeline. Any calls made from my primary smartphone or the estate landlines were likely compromised, especially if Derek was involved. My son had access to the company technology department, and I would not put it past him to monitor my communications. I slipped the burner phone into my deep trouser pocket, feeling the reassuring weight of it against my leg. Step 1 was complete. I had a secure way to communicate. Now I needed eyes. I needed to know exactly what Diane was doing when she thought no one was watching. I moved quietly behind my massive oak desk. Built into the intricate woodwork of the upper hutch was a tiny, almost invisible pinhole camera. I had installed it years ago when I briefly suspected a former housekeeper of stealing sensitive corporate documents, but I had deactivated it shortly after. It was wired to a hidden local hard drive, completely isolated from the main internet network of the house, making it immune to any remote hacking or digital sweeps my son might try to run. I reached under the desk, my fingers tracing the familiar groove in the wood until I found the small, recessed switch. I flipped it. A microscopic blue light blinked twice, deep inside the dark grain of the wood, confirming the lens was active and recording. From this angle, the camera had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire study, the safe area, and the hallway door. If Diane or Derek came in here looking for leverage, I would have every single movement documented in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. I checked my wristwatch. 15 minutes had passed. The shower water upstairs abruptly stopped flowing. The silence that followed was thick and heavy with anticipation. I quickly grabbed a stack of financial reports, spread them haphazardly across my desk, and opened a random spreadsheet on my computer monitor. I needed to look busy, completely absorbed in mundane corporate matters, far away from the truth I had just uncovered. I sat down, picked up a pen, and regulated my breathing. Soft footsteps echoed on the upper landing. Diane was moving through the house. I heard the faint rustle of silk as she put on her robe. The stairs groaned slightly under her weight as she descended to the main floor. I kept my eyes glued to the documents, my pen hovering over the paper, but my ears were strained to their absolute limit. She did not walk toward the kitchen or the living room. Instead, Her footsteps moved quietly down the hall, stopping outside the heavy door of my study. The door was slightly ajar, leaving a crack just wide enough for sound to travel through. She was checking on me. She wanted to make sure the old man was exactly where she left him, docile and oblivious. I did not look up. I turned a page of the report, making sure the paper rustled loudly enough for her to hear. I waited. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. I could sense her standing there in the shadows of the hallway, watching me like a hawk observing its prey. Finally, the floorboards creaked as she shifted her weight and turned away. But she did not go far. She stepped into the adjoining sitting room, a space connected to the hallway. I heard the faint sound of a phone dialing. She waited for a moment, and then her voice drifted through the silence. It was barely a whisper, completely stripped of the manufactured panic she had displayed for the police. It was a cold, calculating tone that chilled me to the bone. The old man bought it. Initiate Step 2. The morning sun pierced through the heavy velvet curtains of my study, but the light brought absolutely no warmth to my tired bones. I had not slept a single wink. I had spent the entire night sitting in my leather armchair, reviewing corporate bylaws and quietly mapping out my defense strategy. The burner phone rested silently in my pocket, a heavy reminder of the war that had just been declared inside my own home. My wife had initiated Step 2. I did not have to wait long to find out exactly what that sinister phrase actually meant in brutal reality. Promptly at 9 in the morning, the heavy mahogany front doors of the estate chimed loudly, echoing through the quiet foyer. I heard the sharp, confident click of expensive leather shoes against the marble floor. It was a walk I recognized instantly. It was my son. Derek walked into the grand living room, completely unannounced. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, projecting the image of a successful corporate heir. But he was not alone. Walking closely behind him was a tall, severe-looking man in a tweed jacket, carrying a thick, dark brown leather medical briefcase. The stranger had cold, clinical eyes that immediately swept over me, analyzing my posture and my expression. I remained seated on the velvet sofa, holding a cup of black coffee, keeping my hands perfectly steady. Diane suddenly appeared from the hallway, rushing to his side with a look of manufactured anxiety painted across her face. She wrung her hands together, playing the role of the distressed, caring wife to absolute perfection. I took a slow sip of my coffee, waiting for the performance to begin. Derek took a breath, adopting a tone of overwhelming pity that made my stomach turn. He knelt down so he was eye level with me, placing a hand gently on my knee. He told me that he loved me, and that he and Diane were deeply concerned about my mental health. He said the stress of the upcoming initial public offering was clearly taking a massive toll on my fragile mind. I looked at the man standing behind him and asked, in a perfectly calm voice, who he had brought into my home. Derek sighed heavily, looking at Diane for emotional support, before turning back to me. He introduced the man as Dr. Aris Thorne. He said the doctor was a leading geriatric psychiatrist from the city. Derek claimed they brought him here because they were terrified by the things I had been saying the night before. I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my carefully constructed facade of mild confusion. I asked him what he meant. Diane stepped forward, a single tear rolling down her cheek. She sobbed quietly, telling the doctor that I had been completely hysterical after a minor misunderstanding at the lake. She claimed that I was suffering from severe delusions, that I was frantically talking about my deceased daughter-in-law again. She claimed I believed Rachel was alive and well on a tropical beach. She told the doctor I was hallucinating ghosts, unable to distinguish reality from my tragic memories. The doctor nodded gravely, pulling a silver pen from his pocket and making a quick note on his clipboard. He looked at me with an expression of professional sympathy that felt entirely rehearsed. I realized exactly what step 2 was. They were building a medical case against my sanity. Derek stood up, reached into his tailored jacket, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents very securely stapled tightly together. He placed the heavy pile of paper on the glass coffee table right in front of me. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Petition for competency evaluation and temporary conservatorship." My eyes scanned the legal jargon, my mind processing the sheer audacity of their attack. They were petitioning the state court to declare me mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. They wanted to legally strip me of my voting rights on the board of directors, effectively neutralizing my power right before the most lucrative financial event in the history of my entire logistics company. They needed me out of the way so they could seize complete control of the corporate accounts and the massive influx of public capital. I looked from the legal petition up to his rigid face. His eyes were entirely devoid of guilt. He looked at me not as a father, but as an obstacle that needed to be legally bulldozed. He spoke softly, explaining that the doctor was just here to ask me a few simple questions. He promised that if I cooperated, they could handle this quietly without involving the press. He said it was for my own good. He claimed it would protect the legacy I had built from my deteriorating mental state. He told me that sometimes our minds play cruel tricks on us as we age, and there was no shame in stepping down to receive the proper medical care I so desperately needed today. The sheer manipulation was breathtaking. They were using my manufactured grief against me, twisting the narrative so tightly that any attempt to defend myself would only make me look more unhinged to the observing psychiatrist. If I started yelling about the photograph, the doctor would immediately document a paranoid psychotic break. If I told them I knew they were stealing millions, they would have the legal grounds to lock me in a secure facility by sunset. I was trapped in an invisible cage woven from their lies. The doctor stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescension, and asked me if I knew what day of the week it was. He was treating a titan of industry like a helpless toddler. The rage bubbling inside my chest threatened to boil over, but I forced it down, burying it deep beneath a layer of calculated submission. I needed more time to trap them. If I answered his insulting question with calm logic, the psychiatrist would simply document that I was in deep denial. If I tried to explain the deepfake photograph and the missing $1 million, he would diagnose me with severe paranoid schizophrenia. They had boxed me into a corner where my sanity was a liability. I needed to give them exactly what they came for. I needed to give them a spectacular show of mental decline, but it had to be completely on my terms. The doctor leaned forward, his pen hovering over his clipboard, waiting for me to tell him what day of the week it was. I looked at the pen, then at Derek, who was watching me with an expression of thinly veiled anticipation. I let my breathing become shallow and ragged. I allowed my hands to shake visibly against the porcelain of my coffee cup. I suddenly slammed the cup down onto the glass table, making the dark liquid splash over the edges. I stood up so quickly that my knees popped, an authentic sound of my advanced age that added perfect realism to my performance. "What day is it?" I shouted, letting my voice crack with manufactured hysteria. "You bring a stranger into my home, you slap legal papers on my table, and you ask me what day it is?" Diane immediately gasped, taking a dramatic step back and clutching her chest. Derek quickly reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. I saw the red recording light blink on. He was documenting my supposed dementia for the judge. This was my moment. I turned my manic gaze toward the corner of the room, right where a priceless antique vase rested on a mahogany pedestal. I had bought that vase at an auction in London 30 years ago. It was beautiful, but it was just an object. My freedom was worth far more than any piece of fragile porcelain. I stumbled aggressively toward the pedestal, waving my arms wildly in the air, shouting incoherently about thieves and traitors hiding in my own house. The doctor stood up in absolute alarm, holding his hands out in a desperate, placating gesture. Derek stepped back, keeping the camera lens squarely focused on my face. With a roar of fake madness, I swung my arm and struck the heavy vase. It toppled off the pedestal and hit the marble floor with a deafening crash. Hundreds of sharp porcelain shards exploded across the room like shrapnel. Diane screamed a perfect, piercing scream that echoed off the high ceilings. The doctor flinched, instinctively raising his clipboard to shield his face from the flying debris. For exactly 2 seconds, every single eye in the room was completely locked on the spectacular destruction happening at waist level. No one was looking at my hands. No one was looking at the floor near my feet. In that vital fraction of a second, amidst the echoing crash and the manufactured chaos, I slipped my right hand deep into my trouser pocket. I grabbed the small plastic burner phone. As I staggered backward, pretending to lose my balance from the force of my own violent outburst, I let the phone slide silently down my leg. It hit the thick edge of the Persian rug without making a single sound. With a swift, practiced flick of the heel of my leather shoe, I kicked the phone completely under the heavy fabric. The dark red and gold patterns of the rug swallowed the device perfectly, hiding it from plain sight. It was a flawless sleight of hand, born from the absolute desperate instinct for survival. I continued my backward stagger, eventually collapsing heavily onto the velvet sofa. I buried my face in my trembling hands, taking deep, ragged breaths. I played the tragic role of the exhausted, deeply confused elderly man whose mind had just violently betrayed him. Through my spread fingers, I watched their immediate reactions to my display. Derek lowered his phone, a sickening smile of absolute triumph playing on his thin lips. He had exactly what he needed to destroy my legal standing. He had a high-definition video of the great Harrison Caldwell acting like a violent, unpredictable lunatic, incapable of managing a massive corporate empire. He looked directly at the psychiatrist to gauge his professional assessment. The doctor was scribbling furiously on his clipboard, his face pale and tight. He was clearly convinced that I was an immediate danger to myself and everyone around me. Diane cautiously stepped forward, crunching a piece of broken porcelain under her expensive designer shoes. She whispered softly to the doctor, asking him if he had seen enough to make a proper clinical determination. The doctor nodded gravely, stating that the visual evaluation was unfortunately very conclusive. He said he would contact the court and expedite the temporary conservatorship order by the end of the day. Derek placed a comforting hand on the doctor's back, guiding him slowly toward the hallway. He turned his head and told me to just rest quietly, promising maliciously that they would take care of everything from now on. They walked out of the grand living room, leaving me entirely alone amidst the shattered remains of my precious antique vase. The heavy front doors clicked shut, plunging the large estate back into a suffocating silence. I slowly lifted my head from my shaking hands. My ragged breathing stopped instantly. The manufactured confusion completely vanished from my eyes, quickly replaced by a cold, hard, and calculating clarity. My old heart was pounding fiercely, a painful physical reminder of my 73 years, but my mind had never been sharper. I stood up, walking carefully over the jagged porcelain shards. I knelt down near the edge of the thick Persian rug and reached underneath the heavy fabric. My fingers brushed against the smooth plastic of the hidden burner phone. I pulled it out, completely undamaged and utterly undetected. The trap was finally set. The heavy oak doors of my study remained firmly shut. I walked over to the tall windows overlooking the sprawling front lawn of my estate. Parked near the front gates, I saw a black vehicle that did not belong to my security team. 2 massive men in dark suits were patrolling the perimeter. Diane had wasted absolutely no time. She had already dismissed my loyal guards, replacing them with hired muscle who answered exclusively to her. I was effectively a prisoner inside the mansion I had built. They thought locking the old man away would secure their victory, but they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the beast they were dealing with. I did not need to step outside to tear their world apart. I just needed my voice and the right man on the other end of the line. I walked into the adjoining marble bathroom. I turned on the brass faucets of the tub, letting the water rush out in a roar. I switched on the ventilation fan above the shower. The combined noise created a perfect acoustic shield, completely drowning out any possibility of being overheard by the thugs patrolling the hallways or any listening devices Derek might have hastily planted. I sat down on the edge of the marble vanity, holding the small plastic burner phone in my steady hands. I punched in a sequence of 10 numbers from pure memory. It was a number I had not dialed in over 4 years, but it was permanently etched into my brain for a moment exactly like this. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. He simply said a single word, asking who was calling. I told him it was Harrison Caldwell. For a brief second, the line was completely silent, filled only with faint static. Then, the voice shifted, softening just a fraction, acknowledging my name with genuine respect. It was Victor. He was a former federal agent who hunted organized crime syndicates before retiring to open a private intelligence firm. Victor was a ghost, a man who traded in shadows and possessed a terrifying set of skills. We had crossed paths a decade ago during a hostile corporate takeover where my rivals tried to frame me for embezzlement. Victor had systematically dismantled their false evidence, saving my company and my reputation. I had paid him a fortune, but more importantly, we had forged an unbreakable bond of mutual respect. He owed me nothing, but I knew he would never turn down a hunt. I told him I had a severe domestic situation, requiring immediate discretion. I explained that my own family was actively orchestrating a hostile takeover of my estate, my company, and my freedom. I briefly summarized the morning events, describing the deepfake photograph, the corrupt psychiatrist, and the threat of a conservatorship. Victor listened without interrupting, his silence radiating a cold, clinical focus. When I finished detailing their coordinated attack, he asked me exactly what I needed him to do. His tone was not sympathetic. It was purely tactical, which was exactly why I trusted him with my life. I gave him 2 highly specific directives. First, I told him about the rose gold Patek Philippe watch I had gifted my son, Derek, just last week. It was a customized Grand Complications model from Switzerland. A watch of that caliber was not just a timepiece. It was high technology. It contained an integrated global positioning system chip, designed specifically for tracking in the event of theft. The manufacturer kept a backdoor access channel for law enforcement. I told Victor to use his old federal contacts to breach that specific tracking database. I needed to know the exact coordinates of that watch over the past 7 days. I needed to know the precise longitude and latitude of that tropical beach where my son had stood, smiling with my supposedly dead daughter-in-law. Victor confirmed the details, typing rapidly on a keyboard. Then, I gave him the second, far more morbid task. I needed him to excavate the medical history of Rachel Caldwell. I told him to dig up every single record from exactly 5 years ago. I wanted the original hospital admission forms, the attending physician notes, the pharmacy logs, and most importantly, the official death certificate. I told him to trace every single dollar that flowed out of my accounts to pay for her experimental cancer treatments, and find out exactly whose pockets that money ultimately landed in. If she was alive and smiling in that photograph, then the body we buried 5 years ago belonged to someone else. I needed to know who orchestrated the medical fraud, who signed the forged documents, and how deep this massive conspiracy truly ran. Victor stopped typing. He took a slow breath, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal I had just laid out before him. He told me that faking a death and defrauding a multi-million-dollar charity fund was a massive federal offense. He promised to put his analysts on it immediately, working until he had undeniable proof. He warned me to play along with my wife and son, to keep my head down and avoid giving them any further ammunition for their psychiatric petition. I assured him that I was already playing the part of the broken, helpless victim to absolute perfection. We synchronized our watches. He told me he would contact me on this exact secure line the moment he had something concrete. I hung up the phone. The small digital screen went black, instantly cutting the secure connection. I sat alone in the roaring noise of the bathroom, staring at my reflection. The man staring back looked tired, his face heavily lined with the immense weight of 73 years. Behind the wrinkles, the blazing fire of a relentless predator burned brighter than ever before. I slipped the burner phone into my pocket, turning off the water to wait for the hound to return with his catch. I stood in the sudden silence of the marble bathroom. The water had drained away, leaving only the damp chill in the air. Time seemed to stretch infinitely. Every minute that passed felt like an hour pressing down on my chest. I stared at the burner phone resting on the vanity counter, willing it to ring. I knew Victor was fast, but the magnitude of what I had asked him to uncover was staggering. Just as the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed noon, the small plastic device vibrated against the marble. I snatched it up instantly, pressing the speaker to my ear. I did not say a word. I just breathed, waiting for the hound to deliver his report. Victor spoke in a voice entirely stripped of emotion. He told me he had breached the backdoor server for the watch manufacturer. The global positioning system chip embedded inside the rose gold casing of the watch I gave my son had pinged a cellular tower exactly 3 days ago. I asked him where it was. He told me it was located at a highly exclusive private resort on the Grand Cayman Island. That pristine tropical beach in the photograph was real, and it was nestled securely in a notorious offshore banking haven. Derek had flown down there immediately after his birthday dinner to celebrate his upcoming theft with the woman I had mourned for 5 long years. But the watch was only the beginning. Victor paused, and I could hear the faint click of a computer mouse on his end of the line. He warned me that what he was about to say was going to be difficult to hear. He had hacked into the secure medical database of the oncology ward, where Rachel supposedly spent her final weeks. He pulled up the official death certificate. It was signed precisely 5 years ago by Dr. Aris Thorne. My blood ran completely cold. It was the exact same psychiatrist who had just walked out of my living room an hour ago. The man trying to declare me mentally incompetent today was the very same doctor who pronounced my daughter-in-law dead half a decade ago. I gripped the edge of the sink, feeling the room spin slightly. I asked Victor whose body was buried in the expensive mahogany casket I had purchased. Victor explained that on the exact same morning, Rachel supposedly passed away. A Jane Doe had died in the charity wing of the exact same hospital. She was a homeless woman of roughly the same age and physical build, abandoned by society and suffering from a fatal respiratory infection. Dr. Thorne had deliberately altered the hospital morgue records. He swapped the identification tags. The tragic funeral I hosted, the tears I shed over that polished wooden box, the agonizing grief that nearly broke my spirit. It was all a theatrical performance staged over the remains of a forgotten stranger. I asked why a respected physician would risk his entire medical license and his freedom to orchestrate such a massive, horrific federal crime. Victor had the answer ready. He had followed the money. 2 weeks after the funeral, a shell corporation registered in Delaware purchased a luxury 80-foot yacht. The vessel was quietly transferred into a blind trust controlled entirely by Dr. Thorne. The purchase price was precisely $3 million. Victor dug into the funding of that shell corporation. The money had originated from a series of complex wire transfers initiated by my own wife. Diane had bought the doctor a floating palace in exchange for a forged death certificate and a stolen corpse. The grand design of their betrayal finally crystallized in my mind. The The $15 million charity fund I had established in memory of Rachel was never meant to help anyone. I had poured my personal wealth into that foundation to honor the woman I thought my son loved. But Victor revealed that over the past 5 years, the charity had been bleeding money through fraudulent grants and phantom administrative costs. It was nothing more than a personal automated teller machine for the three of them. Diane, Derek, and Rachel were using my grief as a bottomless well of untraceable cash. They had successfully stolen millions, and now, with the upcoming public offering, they were positioning themselves to steal the entire logistics empire. Victor told me he was compiling all the digital evidence into a secure, encrypted file. He warned me again that Dr. Thorne would likely file the temporary conservatorship paperwork by the time the courthouse opened tomorrow morning. They were accelerating their timeline because of the missing safe. Diane knew the original trust documents were gone, and she needed me legally neutralized before I could investigate further. Victor told me I had less than 24 hours before a judge would officially strip away my rights and hand complete control of my life over to my son. He offered to call his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation to raid the estate immediately. I told him no. I told him to hold the federal agents back. I needed to handle this internal family betrayal my own way before the justice system stepped in permanently. If the authorities raided the house right now, Diane and Derek would immediately lawyer up. They would drag the proceedings out through years of painful litigation, using the very money they stole from me to fund their defense. I wanted them utterly destroyed. I wanted them to feel the exact same sheer terror and absolute helplessness they had just tried to inflict upon me. I thanked Victor for his exceptional work and told him to keep monitoring the offshore accounts very closely. I hung up the phone. I looked into the mirror one last time. The grieving father was dead. The confused old man was gone. I walked out of the bathroom, ready to calmly host the final dinner party they would ever attend in their lives. The sun dipped below the Texas horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns of my estate. By 7 in the evening, the grand dining room was completely transformed into a stage for their carefully orchestrated theater. The long mahogany table was set with our finest crystal and antique silver, shining under the warm glow of the crystal chandelier. Diane had personally overseen every single detail, ensuring the atmosphere was perfectly suited for a gathering of the most powerful people in my company. She had invited the entire board of directors, the men and women who held the keys to the upcoming initial public offering. They were the very people Derek needed to convince of my sudden mental decline. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, listening to the hum of their polite conversation, drifting up from the foyer. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit, letting my shoulders slump just a fraction. I slowed my breathing, intentionally dulling the sharp focus in my eyes to mimic the vacant stare of a man slowly losing his grip on reality. I slowly descended the stairs, making sure my footsteps were heavy and slightly uneven. Diane was waiting at the bottom, wearing a perfectly understated black evening gown. She immediately rushed to my side, slipping her arm through mine with an exaggerated display of physical support. She patted my hand, looking up at me with wide, tragic eyes designed to be noticed by everyone in the room. The board members turned their attention toward us. These were men I had fought alongside in corporate trenches, people who had trusted my vision for decades. Now, they looked at me with varying degrees of pity and awkwardness. Derek stood near the fireplace holding a glass of bourbon, wearing a somber expression that masked his absolute thrill. He stepped forward to greet me, speaking in a slow, loud voice one might use when addressing a confused child. He asked me if I was feeling up to joining them for dinner. I gave a slow, hesitant nod, letting my lower lip tremble slightly before offering a weak, disjointed greeting to the room. Diane guided me to the head of the long table, pulling out my heavy wooden chair with the help of a hired waiter. I sat down heavily, letting my posture collapse into a slight hunch. The dinner service began seamlessly, a parade of expensive wine and gourmet courses designed to project stability and wealth. But the true purpose of the evening was completely transparent to my calculating mind. Derek and Diane were deliberately steering the conversation toward complex corporate strategies and the intricate details of the upcoming stock market launch. They wanted to expose my supposed inability to track the conversation. I played right into their hands. When our chief financial officer directed a specific question toward me regarding our quarterly projections, I simply stared at him. I let the silence stretch out uncomfortably long. I blinked several times, looking around the table as if the faces of my oldest colleagues were suddenly completely unfamiliar to me. I opened my mouth to speak, but intentionally stumbled over the first syllable, my voice raspy and frail. I stammered, mixing up the names of our regional distribution centers, confidently stating logistics figures that were at least 10 years out of date. The silence in the dining room became suffocating. The chief financial officer cleared his throat, looking down at his plate in profound embarrassment. I saw Derek exchange a fleeting, triumphant glance with Diane across the table. They were winning the narrative. I decided to elevate the performance. I reached for my crystal water goblet with a violently trembling right hand. I allowed my fingers to spasm just as the glass lifted from the linen tablecloth. The heavy crystal tipped, spilling ice-cold water across the polished mahogany wood and onto my own lap. I gasped, putting on a display of acute, helpless distress. Diane immediately leaped out of her chair, rushing to my side with a linen napkin, cooing softly and dabbing at my trousers, while apologizing profusely to the stunned board members. She told them I had been having a very difficult day, emphasizing the word difficult to ensure they understood the underlying medical implication. I quickly mumbled a very sad, disjointed apology, keeping my head bowed in fabricated shame. The main course was served, a beautiful cut of prime beef, but I made sure my struggle continued. I picked up my heavy silver fork and knife. I made a pathetic attempt to cut the meat, intentionally letting the silver knife screech loudly against the fine porcelain plate. The grating sound made several board members physically wince. Then, with perfectly timed clumsiness, I let the heavy fork slip entirely from my grasp. It clattered loudly against the plate before tumbling off the edge of the table and hitting the marble floor with a sharp, ringing thud. The entire table froze in absolute, stunned silence. Derek let out a heavy, incredibly patronizing sigh. He stood up, walked over to my chair, and picked up the fallen silverware. He placed a firm, condescending hand on my shoulder, leaning in so the entire board could hear his sympathetic whisper. He told me that maybe it was time for me to go upstairs and rest, suggesting that the business talk was simply too overwhelming for my current condition. I looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, nodding weakly in complete submission. But beneath the surface of my frightened expression, a cold, dark fury was burning with absolute intensity. I had given them the perfect show, playing the exact tragic role they so desperately needed tonight. I had convinced the entire board of directors that Harrison Caldwell was a broken, deteriorating old man. They had swallowed the bait completely, totally unaware that the helpless lamb sitting at the head of their table was actually a wolf preparing to tear their entire world to shreds. But I did not rise from my heavy wooden chair. Instead, I raised a trembling hand, waving off my son's condescending offer of rest. I let out a long, ragged sigh, playing the part of a nostalgic elder statesman who just wanted a few more minutes of dignity among his peers. I told the board that I was fine, just tired, but I wanted to share one last thought before dessert. Derek frowned, his jaw tightening slightly. He did not want me speaking anymore, fearful that I might accidentally ruin the perfect narrative he had just established. But the board members, driven by a profound sense of awkward pity and decades of residual respect, insisted that I speak. The chief financial officer offered a gentle smile, telling me to take my time. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the white linen tablecloth. I looked around the room, letting my gaze brush past the faces of my colleagues before finally settling on Diane and Derek. The dining room grew entirely quiet, save for the soft clinking of silverware from the kitchen. I began my story in a soft, meandering tone, the classic cadence of an old man lost in his own memories. I told them a fable my grandfather supposedly shared with me when I was just a boy growing up on a dusty farm. It was a story about an old, hard-working farmer who spent his entire life cultivating a massive, prosperous orchard. The farmer was generous, perhaps to a fault. One bitter winter, he found a freezing snake near the edge of his property. Taking pity on the creature, the farmer brought it inside his warm house, feeding it and giving it shelter. He treated the snake as if it were his own flesh and blood, warming its scales by the hearth and offering it the finest milk from his barn. Diane forced a polite smile, but her eyes darted nervously toward Derek. They both assumed this was just another symptom of my deteriorating mind, a harmless ramble completely disconnected from the corporate discussions. I continued the story, my voice growing slightly steadier. I described how the snake grew strong and fat off the farmer's generosity. But a snake is still a snake, bound tightly by its cold, unforgiving nature. One night, the snake finally struck. It bit the old farmer while he slept, releasing a slow, paralyzing venom directly into his veins. Thinking the farmer was dead, the snake raided the farmhouse, swallowing all the gold the man had saved for generations. Then, the snake slithered away, slipping into the dark waters to escape the terrible crime it had committed. By this point, the board members were nodding, waiting for the moral to wrap up so they could return to their one. But I was not finished. I lowered my voice, infusing it with a sudden, chilling clarity that completely shattered my frail persona for just a single heartbeat. I told the table that the snake swam far across the ocean, seeking a distant place where the old farmer could never find it. It found a pristine, sun-drenched beach. I locked my eyes directly onto my wife. I stated with absolute terrifying precision that the snake hid away on a very specific, exclusive private resort located directly on the Grand Cayman Island. I described the warm white sand and the clear blue water of the Caribbean. I mentioned how the snake lay there in the tropical sun, surrounded by stolen wealth, completely convinced that the old farmer was too weak, too foolish, and too blind to ever track it down. I described how the snake laughed, believing it had executed the perfect escape. As the words Grand Cayman Island left my lips, the temperature in the dining room seemed to plummet instantly. Diane's polite, manufactured smile vanished. All the color drained rapidly from her face, leaving her pale and ghostly under the bright chandelier. Her breathing hitched sharply in her throat. Derek froze entirely, the color of his knuckles turning bone white as he gripped the heavy edge of the mahogany table. They knew. In that singular, suspended moment, the terrifying realization crashed down upon them with the destructive force of a freight train. They realized that the helpless old man sitting at the head of the table was not rambling. I was reading them their own death sentence, exposing their deepest secret right in front of the entire corporate board. Diane had been nervously holding her delicate crystal wine glass by the thin stem. As my piercing gaze remained locked intensely on her terrified eyes, her hand clamped down with involuntary, violent force. The fragile crystal snapped under the sudden, massive pressure. The glass shattered into a dozen sharp pieces right in the soft palm of her hand. The dark red wine exploded across the pristine white linen tablecloth, looking exactly like fresh, glistening blood. Diane let out a sharp, genuine cry of profound pain, dropping the broken, jagged stem onto her porcelain plate. The sudden, violent noise jolted the entire room out of the heavy, suffocating silence. Several board members gasped loudly, pushing their heavy chairs back as the red stain quickly spread across the expensive table. Blood dripped steadily from Diane's palm, mixing with the spilled wine. Derek leaped out of his chair, ignoring the board. He grabbed a thick cloth napkin and pressed it hard against his mother's bleeding hand, his eyes wide with an absolute, unadulterated panic that he could no longer hide. I immediately slumped back into my heavy wooden chair, letting my face fall back into an expression of bewildered, pathetic shock. I mumbled a string of confused, disjointed apologies, pretending that the sudden noise and the sight of blood had startled my fragile nerves. I watched them scramble in sheer, absolute terror. The seed of paranoia was perfectly planted deep in their minds. They thought they had trapped an old man, but they had merely awakened a monster. The dinner party ended in complete disarray. The board members left the estate quickly. They murmured awkward apologies as they stepped out into the cool night air. They were undoubtedly unsettled by the blood on the table and my supposed mental collapse. Derek escorted them out. He played the role of the burdened son, while the hired medical staff bandaged the deeply cut hand of his mother. I was escorted back upstairs to my master suite by one of the new, muscular bodyguards Diane had employed. He shoved me into the room, locking the heavy door. I listened to the click of the deadbolt. They thought they had secured me for the night. They thought I was trapped in the dark, trembling with dementia. They were entirely wrong. I walked quietly over to the adjoining private study connected to my bedroom. I pulled down the heavy blackout curtains and turned on a small, shielded desk lamp. I retrieved my burner phone from my pocket and logged into the secure, isolated network connecting to the hidden pinhole camera I had activated earlier. The high-definition feed flickered onto the small screen. I could see the grand living room downstairs perfectly. The guests were gone. Diane and Derek were pacing furiously across the marble floor. Their frantic body language told me everything I needed to know. The fable I had spun at the dinner table had completely shattered their carefully constructed confidence. Diane was clutching her bandaged hand against her chest, her face pale and shining with cold sweat. Derek was running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, pointing angrily at the ceiling toward my room. They knew the Cayman Island reference was not a coincidence. They knew the timeline for their hostile takeover had just evaporated. The temporary conservatorship hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning was no longer fast enough. If I knew about Rachel and the offshore accounts, I could blow the entire initial public offering to pieces before the judge even hit his gavel. They were backed into a corner of their own making. I watched the digital feed closely as Diane suddenly stopped pacing. She looked directly at Derek, her eyes hardening into something ruthless and cold. She walked over to the antique bar cart in the corner of the room. She reached into the deep pocket of her black evening gown and pulled out a small, dark glass vial. I recognized that vial instantly. It was the same highly concentrated liquid sedative the corrupt psychiatrist, Dr. Thorne, had prescribed to help calm my supposed anxiety. A few drops would induce a deep, dreamless sleep, but Diane was not measuring drops. I watched in cold fascination as she unscrewed the cap and poured the entire contents of the vial into a crystal glass filled with ice water. It was a massive, lethal dose. If a 73-year-old man with a supposedly weak heart consumed that much sedative, his respiratory system would simply shut down. It would look exactly like a natural, tragic stroke in his sleep. The medical examiner, likely paid off by Dr. Thorne, would sign the death certificate without a second thought. My wife was preparing to murder me in my own bed. She handed the glass to the towering bodyguard standing near the hallway entrance. She gave him a set of quiet, explicit instructions. He nodded, his face completely devoid of any moral hesitation, and began walking up the grand staircase. I immediately turned off the burner phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I hurried into the bedroom, turned off the bedside lamp, and slipped under the heavy silk sheets. I closed my eyes, steadying my breathing to mimic the slow, rhythmic cadence of a man deep in slumber. A few moments later, the heavy deadbolt clicked open. The wooden door creaked loudly. The bodyguard stepped into the room, his boots muffling against the Persian carpet. I kept my eyes shut, peeking only through the microscopic sliver of my eyelashes. He walked over to my bedside table. He placed the poisoned crystal glass down on the marble coaster with a soft clink. He stood over me for a long, terrifying moment, listening to my steady breathing to ensure I was completely unaware. Satisfied, he turned around and walked back out, pulling the door shut behind him. However, he did not lock the deadbolt this time. I heard his heavy footsteps settle into the leather armchair stationed right outside my door in the hallway. He was standing guard, waiting for me to wake up, drink the water, and quietly expire. I threw off the covers and stood up silently. My bare feet made absolutely no sound against the carpet. I looked at the crystal glass sitting on the nightstand. The ice cubes clinked softly against the rim. I could simply pour the poisoned water down the bathroom sink and pretend I never touched it. But that would only delay the inevitable. If I survived the night, Diane would simply try another, more violent method in the morning. I needed to send a message so terrifying, so profoundly disturbing, that it would completely paralyze her. I needed to use her own lethal weapon against her. I formulated a plan in the span of 3 seconds. I walked quietly to the door and pressed my ear against the wood. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a heavy bass line coming from the hallway. The bodyguard was wearing headphones, likely listening to music to pass the long, boring hours of his night shift. I slowly turned the brass doorknob, inching the door open just a fraction. The hallway was dimly lit. The massive bodyguard was sitting in the armchair, his eyes closed. Resting on the small wooden side table right next to his elbow was his own crystal glass, filled with ice water. I slipped through the gap. I smoothly swapped his clean water with my poisoned glass, then silently retreated into my bedroom. I slipped back beneath the heavy silk sheets, my heart hammering a steady, controlled rhythm against my ribs. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and closed my eyes, leaving just a tiny sliver of vision directed toward the gap under the heavy oak door. The silence in the bedroom was absolute, contrasting sharply with the faint, muffled thumping of the music coming from the hallway. I lay perfectly still, waiting for the trap to spring. I did not have to wait long. About 10 minutes passed before I heard the distinct sound of ice cubes clinking against crystal. The bodyguard had shifted in his leather armchair. He was thirsty. I heard the faint sound of swallowing, followed immediately by a sharp, confused gasp. Dr. Thorne's sedative was incredibly potent, designed to shut down the central nervous system of a frail old man in minutes. For a massive, muscular bodyguard, the concentrated dose hit his bloodstream like a freight train. The heavy crystal glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor with a sharp crash. I heard the leather armchair creak violently as the man tried to stand up. He took one heavy, uncoordinated step before his legs failed him. He hit the floor with a sickening thud, sending a faint vibration through the floorboards into my mattress. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my breathing slow and even, playing the part of the oblivious, sleeping victim to absolute perfection. Outside the door, a terrifying struggle for oxygen was taking place. I heard the man gagging, a wet, choking sound as the lethal sedative paralyzed his throat muscles. His heavy boots kicked erratically against the baseboards in a desperate, involuntary spasm. Thick white foam began to bubble from his mouth as his lungs fought a losing battle against the chemical shutdown. The violent thrashing lasted for less than 2 minutes, before it gradually slowed down. The heavy kicking turned into weak twitches, and finally, the hallway went completely silent. The massive bodyguard lay motionless on the floor, effectively neutralized by the very poison my wife had intended for me. I carefully reached under my pillow and pulled out the small plastic burner phone. I turned the camera on, ensuring the flash was completely disabled. I crept silently out of bed and crouched beside the slightly ajar bedroom door. I pressed the tiny lens against the narrow crack, giving me a perfect, high-definition view of the dimly lit hallway. The giant man was sprawled face down on the Persian runner, his massive chest barely rising. Suddenly, I heard the frantic, rapid clicking of high heels rushing up the grand staircase. Diane had heard the crash. She rounded the corner, completely out of breath, expecting to find the bodyguard standing watch over my corpse. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks, letting out a sharp, muffled gasp of absolute horror. Derek was right behind her, his tailored suit jacket discarded, his eyes wide with shock. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the motionless bodyguard. He pressed 2 fingers against the man's thick neck, checking for a pulse. He looked up at his mother, his face completely drained of color. He whispered frantically, asking her what she had done. Diane stared at the shattered crystal glass on the floor, her hands trembling violently. She shook her head in sheer panic, her voice barely a harsh whisper. She realized exactly what had happened. She assumed the bodyguard had gotten thirsty and foolishly drank from the poisoned glass he was supposed to leave for me. She had accidentally murdered her own hired muscle. I held the camera perfectly steady, recording every single second of their panicked realization. They were trapped in a nightmare of their own creation. They could not call an ambulance, and they certainly could not call Sheriff Thompson. Bringing the authorities into the house to investigate the poisoning of a bodyguard would instantly expose their entire conspiracy, destroying the upcoming stock market launch and sending them both to federal prison. They had only one option left. They had to make the body disappear before the morning staff arrived. Derek stood up, his breathing shallow and erratic. He grabbed the man by his broad shoulders, trying to lift him, but the dead weight of the muscular guard was simply too much for his soft, corporate hands. He dropped the shoulders, cursing quietly in the dark. Diane stepped forward, her face hardening into that same cold, ruthless expression I had seen earlier. She did not hesitate. She grabbed the heavy leather belt around the man's waist and pulled with all her might. Derek grabbed the man's arms, and together they began to drag him down the long hallway toward the service elevator. I kept the camera rolling, capturing the grotesque scene unfolding just feet away from my door. I watched my elegant, sophisticated wife straining under the immense weight, her expensive black evening gown dragging along the carpet. She heaved and pulled, her teeth gritted in sheer desperation. The scene was incredibly familiar. It was an exact, chilling mirror image of the moment I had witnessed at 4 o'clock in the morning at Lake Travis. Just a few days ago, she had been dragging my heavy steel safe down a muddy riverbank, believing she was sinking my legacy into the dark water. Now she was dragging a human being down our luxurious hallway, desperately trying to sink her own horrific mistakes. The poetic justice of the moment was not lost on me. I recorded the dark, wet stain the foaming mouth left on the expensive Persian runner. I recorded the terrified, exhausted faces of my wife and son as they struggled to heave the massive body into the service elevator. The metal doors finally slid shut, swallowing them and their dark burden whole. The hallway was empty again, save for the broken glass and absolute silence. I stopped the recording and immediately initiated a secure transfer. Within seconds, the high-definition video file was encrypted and sent directly to the private server Victor had established for me. They could break my phone, they could burn down the entire estate, but they could never erase the digital evidence I had just captured. I stood up in the dark bedroom, feeling a cold, satisfying smile spread across my face. They thought they were the apex predators circling a weak, dying animal. They had absolutely no idea that every single move they made, every lie they told, and every crime they committed was being meticulously documented by the man they thought they were burying. The corporate board would not save them tomorrow. The corrupt doctor could not save them. Their offshore money could not protect them from a murder charge. I slipped beneath the heavy silk sheets once more, ready to face the dawn. The endgame was rapidly approaching. and I held every single card in the deck. I closed my eyes and finally allowed myself to fall into a peaceful sleep. My peaceful sleep did not last for very long at all. At exactly 2 in the morning, a sharp vibration beneath my pillow pulled me from unconsciousness. I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling of my master suite. The massive estate was silent again. The horrific events in the hallway with the poisoned bodyguard felt like a distant nightmare, but the buzzing device against my mattress brought me back to cold reality. I reached under the silk fabric and pulled out the burner phone. The digital screen glowed brightly with a harsh, glaring blue light. It was a secure message from Victor, containing 2 words: "Call me." I sat up immediately, throwing the blankets aside. The cold night air hit my skin, fully waking my senses. I slowly slipped out of bed, walking quietly to the adjoining master bathroom. I closed the wooden door behind me and turned on the sink faucet, letting the rushing water create a secure acoustic shield in case my wife or son were lurking in the hallway. I dialed the secure 10-digit number from memory. Victor answered on the very first ring, completely skipping polite greetings. His deep voice was tight with an urgency I had never heard from him before. He told me my son had just made a very desperate move. Victor explained that the near death of the hired muscle must have pushed Diane and Derek into absolute panic. They realized their timeline was crumbling. They could not wait for the morning conservatorship hearing with the corrupt psychiatrist. They needed to secure the money immediately and flee before authorities discovered the dead weight they had shoved into the service elevator. Victor told me that less than 10 minutes ago, a massive digital authorization was initiated on my corporate server. Derek was bypassing standard protocol. He was using a temporary power of attorney document, a restricted legal form I authorized years ago for basic operational emergencies when traveling overseas. Derek somehow manipulated the digital signature clearances within the banking system to elevate his administrative privileges. I stood in the cold marble bathroom, gripping the sink, listening as Victor delivered the devastating numbers. Derek was attempting to wire $50 million directly out of our primary operating accounts. It was an astronomical sum, representing the entire liquid cash reserve of my logistics empire. I asked Victor where the massive wire transfer was heading. The answer was exactly what I feared. The money was being routed through a complex web of shell corporations, designed to bounce rapidly across 3 international borders before landing in a secure, anonymous offshore account located in the Grand Cayman Islands. It was the exact same tropical paradise where my supposedly dead daughter-in-law was currently waiting. They were completely draining the lifeblood of my company to fund their escape. My mind raced, calculating the catastrophic financial damage. If that wire transfer successfully cleared our bank and disappeared into untraceable offshore accounts, my life work would be destroyed by sunrise. Without those operating funds, the logistics company would instantly default on massive shipping contracts. We would miss payroll for thousands of hardworking truck drivers and warehouse workers. The corporate debt covenants would immediately trigger, allowing banks to seize our physical assets. The upcoming initial public offering would collapse into a federal investigation. My company would be utterly bankrupt in days, leaving thousands of innocent families without livelihoods, all because my greedy son wanted to live like a king on a stolen beach. I asked Victor how much time I had before the international transaction became permanent and irreversible. I could hear the rapid clicking of his computer keyboard. He told me international wire transfers of this enormous magnitude required a mandatory security clearing period through the federal banking system. Because Derek initiated the transfer in the dead of night, the transaction was currently locked in a pending status. However, the Federal Reserve Automated Clearinghouse would process the queue right before dawn. Victor looked at the digital timestamp on the banking server. He told me I had exactly 2 hours. 120 minutes until $50 million vanished forever, taking my legacy with it. Victor offered to execute a hard shutdown of my company's servers, warning that it would cause operational chaos but might temporarily freeze the outbound money. I firmly told him no, a technical glitch would only delay them. Derek would try again the moment servers came back online, or he would suspect someone was monitoring his digital footprint. I needed a permanent solution. I needed to let him believe he was succeeding, right up until the trap snapped shut on his neck. I instructed Victor to keep monitoring the transfer status without interfering. I ended the call and stood in the bathroom, feeling the immense weight of the ticking clock pressing down on my shoulders. 2 hours. It was barely enough time to formulate a counterattack, let alone execute one against a digital banking system designed to move capital across the globe at lightning speed. My own flesh and blood son was using the very infrastructure I had built to slit my financial throat. I turned off the running water and walked back into the dark bedroom. I did not return to the bed. I walked over to my massive oak closet and began to dress. I put on a crisp white shirt, a dark silk tie, and my sharpest tailored suit. If I was going to wage a corporate war in the middle of the night, I was going to be dressed like the commander of the battlefield. The time for playing the weak, confused old man was officially over. I checked the heavy gold watch on my wrist. The second hand swept forward relentlessly. I reached for the burner phone one more time. There was only one person ruthless enough to help me hijack a $50 million wire transfer. I needed to wake up my corporate lawyer right now. I dialed Bradley's personal number. Bradley was not just a lawyer. He was a corporate shark I had kept on my retainer for over 2 decades. He was the kind of man who enjoyed the smell of blood in the water, especially when it came to hostile takeovers and financial sabotage. The line rang 3 times before he answered. His voice was thick with sleep, but the moment he heard my tone, the grogginess vanished entirely. I did not waste time with apologies for waking him. I told him straight away that my son was attempting to steal $50 million from the primary operating accounts using an emergency power of attorney, and that the transfer was scheduled to clear the Federal Reserve automated system in less than 2 hours. Bradley let out a low whistle. He immediately told me he could log into the secure banking portal right now and freeze the entire account. He said he could lock the company assets down so tight that Derek would not be able to buy a cup of coffee. I stopped him immediately. I told him a hard freeze was the absolute worst possible move we could make. If Derek saw the account locked, he would instantly know I was onto him. He and Diane would panic. They might flee the country using whatever personal cash they had hidden away. Or worse, they might destroy critical documents to cover their tracks. I did not want them to run. I wanted them to walk blindly into a concrete wall. I asked if there was a way to let the transaction process on our end, but change the final destination without alerting the initiator. I could hear Bradley shifting in his bed, the rustle of sheets followed by the heavy thud of his footsteps as he walked into his home office. He was silent for a long moment, processing the legal and technical logistics of my highly unusual request. Then a dark, incredibly satisfying chuckle echoed over the phone line. He told me it was risky, but entirely possible. He called it a routing trap. He explained that because Derek was using my emergency authorization codes, the banking system recognized the massive transfer as completely legitimate. The money was currently sitting patiently in a digital holding queue, waiting for the morning clearance. Bradley said he could use his supreme administrative access to slip quietly into that queue. Once inside, he could discreetly alter the international routing numbers and the specific SWIFT codes attached to the outbound wire. I asked him where we could send $50 million without losing it permanently in the vast digital ether. Bradley had the perfect, most ruthless solution. He told me about a specific federal holding account managed directly by the Internal Revenue Service. It was a highly secure vault used exclusively by federal agents for seizing assets related to high-level corporate financial crimes. He said he could reroute the destination of Derek transfer directly into that impenetrable federal vault. Even better, He could tag the incoming funds with a specific legal tracking code, designating it as active evidence of wire fraud. To Derek, sitting in his room staring at his computer screen inside my mansion, the transfer would appear completely successful. The money would officially leave our corporate accounts just as he intended, completely satisfying his monumental greed. But the moment the money crossed the digital threshold, it would be instantly swallowed by the federal government. The offshore bank account in the tropical Cayman Islands would receive absolutely nothing. And because the money was officially flagged for wire fraud, the authorities would immediately open a silent, devastating investigation into the recipient account, effectively trapping Rachel on her pristine beach as well. It was a brilliantly lethal maneuver that would destroy all three of them simultaneously. I gave Bradley the absolute authorization to proceed. I listened to the rapid, aggressive clicking of his mechanical keyboard through the small speaker of the plastic burner phone. The tension inside my quiet bedroom was thick and suffocating. Every single minute that ticked by on my watch was a minute closer to the automated clearing deadline. I stood perfectly still by the large window, watching the pale moonlight cast long, eerie shadows across the front lawn, waiting for the verbal confirmation that would either save my entire empire or let it crumble into dust. 20 agonizing minutes passed. The silence was only broken by the occasional tense mutter from Bradley as he bypassed multiple layers of internal corporate security protocols. I focused on my breathing, refusing to let the anxiety penetrate my calm exterior. Finally, the rapid, frantic typing abruptly stopped. Bradley let out a deep, heavy sigh of absolute triumph. He told me the trap was successfully set. The international routing numbers were manipulated, the offshore destination was permanently altered, and the federal crime flag was buried deep within the encrypted metadata of the transaction itself. He promised me with absolute certainty that when the clock struck dawn, $50 million would quietly slide right into the unforgiving hands of the Internal Revenue Service. My son would be completely unaware that he had just handed his stolen fortune over to the federal government. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over my tired body. The weight of the potential bankruptcy lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a burning anticipation for the morning. I thanked Bradley quietly, telling him he had just earned double his annual retainer. He laughed a cold laugh, promising to draft the official termination papers for Derek by sunrise. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the mattress. The $50 million was safe, locked in a federal vault where my son could never reach it. I walked to the mirror and adjusted my dark silk tie. I was no longer the hunted victim trapped inside my own home. I was the architect of their total destruction, and the sun was about to rise. The first rays of dawn pierced through the heavy silk curtains of my bedroom, casting a pale, cold light across the Persian rug. I stood perfectly still by the large window, watching the estate grounds slowly illuminate. The long, terrifying night was finally over, and the digital clock on my bedside table silently clicked to 6 in the morning. The automated banking clearance had just occurred. Somewhere in the vast digital network of the Federal Reserve, $50 million had just been quietly swallowed by the Internal Revenue Service, perfectly fulfilling the brilliant routing trap designed by Bradley. I adjusted the cuffs of my crisp white shirt, smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit, and walked out of my master suite. The long hallway was completely empty. The broken crystal glass and the spilled water had been hastily cleaned up, leaving only a faint, damp stain on the expensive runner. There was no sign of the massive bodyguard my wife and son had dragged into the service elevator hours ago. They had spent the entire night cleaning up their horrific mistake, entirely unaware that their grand financial escape had already been neutralized. I walked slowly down the sweeping staircase, my leather shoes clicking softly against the polished marble steps. I walked directly into my private study, the room where this nightmare had begun just a few days ago. I sat down behind my massive oak desk, resting my hands against the cool wood, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. I knew they would not wait long. I did not have to wait more than 20 minutes. The heavy oak door of the study swung open without a single knock. Derek walked in first, followed closely by Diane. They looked absolutely exhausted. Deep circles bruised the delicate skin under the eyes of my wife, and her elegant posture was slightly stooped from the physical labor of moving a paralyzed man. Derek had not bothered to put his tailored suit jacket back on. His silk tie was loosened, and his hair was slightly disheveled. Despite their obvious physical fatigue, their eyes burned with an arrogant, triumphant fire. They walked into my sanctuary with the brazen confidence of conquerors who believed the war was already won. They thought the $50 million was resting safely in their offshore Cayman account, completely securing their luxurious future. They thought they had outsmarted the old wolf. Diane did not rush to my side this time. She did not offer a fake, trembling smile or pretend to care about my fragile nerves. The theatrical performance was officially over. She walked over to the leather armchair facing my desk and sat down, crossing her legs, her face settling into an expression of cold, absolute disdain. She looked at me not as a husband of 10 years, but as a tedious, expiring obstacle she was finally about to remove. Derek walked directly to the front of my massive desk. He did not offer a gentle, patronizing greeting. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and slammed them down onto the polished oak wood with a loud, aggressive thud. The bold black letters across the top page read, "Total Asset Transfer and Relinquishment of Corporate Control." I looked down at the documents, keeping my expression perfectly neutral, playing the role of the defeated, bewildered old man one final time. I looked up at my son and asked him what this was. Derek let out a sharp, cruel laugh. He leaned forward, placing both of his hands flat on my desk, bringing his face dangerously close to mine. He dropped the caring son facade completely, his voice dripping with venom. He told me it was my retirement plan. He stated that the money was already gone, moved to a secure location where I could never reach it. He bragged that he had used my own emergency protocols to drain the corporate operating funds while I was sleeping. He demanded that I sign the papers immediately, legally signing over the entire logistics empire, the sprawling estate, and every single remaining asset to him. I stared into his eyes, searching for even a microscopic trace of guilt, but I found absolutely nothing. There was only a hollow, consuming greed that had entirely rotted his soul from the inside out. I asked him what would happen if I refused to sign. Diane answered from the armchair, her voice echoing with a chilling calm. She casually checked her manicured fingernails as she delivered the ultimate threat. She told me that Dr. Thorne was currently sitting in a private ambulance parked just 3 blocks away from the estate gates. She said the doctor had already signed the medical authorization forms, declaring me a severe, immediate danger to myself. If my signature was not on those legal documents by noon, the ambulance would pull up to the front door. 2 orderlies would strap me to a gurney, inject me with chemical sedatives, and transport me to the most dismal psychiatric ward in the state. She promised me that I would spend the rest of my miserable life locked in a padded room, heavily medicated, while they enjoyed the tropical sun. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that no one would ever believe the ramblings of a crazy old man who thought his dead daughter-in-law was alive. They had boxed me into a perfect corner. It was either total financial surrender or absolute loss of my physical freedom. They waited for my desperate reaction. I slowly lowered my head, letting my shoulders slump in a display of profound defeat. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up my silver pen. The cold metal felt incredibly heavy within my aging fingers. I slowly unscrewed the cap, staring down blindly at the dotted line. I let out a long, ragged sigh, acting exactly like a broken man who realized he had finally lost absolutely everything. I held the tip of the silver pen just a fraction of an inch above the thick white paper. My hand trembled violently, a performance of absolute despair that fed directly into their towering egos. Derek watched me struggle, a cruel, twisted smile spreading across his face. He did not just want my empire. He wanted to break my spirit completely. He wanted me to spend the rest of my life in a padded room knowing exactly how thoroughly I had been dismantled. He took a step closer, leaning over my desk, his voice dropping into a low, mocking whisper. He told me he wanted me to understand everything before they locked me away. He wanted to twist the knife one last time, to ensure my mental torment was absolute and eternal. He began by talking about his profound resentment, a bitter hatred that had been festering inside his chest for his entire adult life. He sneered, his face contorting with a sudden, vicious anger. He told me he hated me from the moment I forced him to start working in the dusty warehouse, carrying heavy boxes instead of handing him the keys to the executive boardroom. He said I treated him like an employee, not a son. I kept my eyes glued to the legal document, letting a single tear fall onto the paper, perfectly playing the shattered father. But Derek was not finished. He turned around and walked slowly toward the leather armchair where my wife was sitting. He reached down, took Diane by her unbandaged hand, and pulled her gently to her feet. What happened next made my stomach churn with a sickening, violent disgust. Right there, in the middle of my private study, my son leaned down and kissed my wife. It was not a brief, familial kiss. It was an intimate, possessive embrace that revealed years of dark, hidden history. Diane smiled, reaching up to stroke his cheek with profound affection. Derek turned back to look at me, his eyes gleaming with a sick, triumphant joy. He confessed the ultimate, horrifying truth. He told me that he and Diane had been sleeping together for 10 years. They had met long before I ever brought her to this estate. Diane was never truly my wife. She was his lover from the very beginning. They had carefully orchestrated our entire marriage, placing her in my path, using her beauty and charm to infiltrate my life and secure a direct legal claim to my vast fortune. Every anniversary, every shared vacation, every quiet evening we spent together was a calculated, disgusting lie designed to slowly bleed me dry. The sheer depravity of their conspiracy was almost too massive to comprehend. I gripped the silver pen so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white, fighting the overwhelming primal urge to leap across the heavy oak desk and strangle them both with my bare hands. But I remained seated, letting my jaw drop in fabricated horror. Derek laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the high walls of the study. He told me the humiliation did not stop there. He wanted to talk about Rachel, the sweet, innocent daughter-in-law whose tragic death had nearly destroyed my heart. He confessed that Rachel was never his real wife. He had never loved her, and they had never even shared a bed. He revealed that Rachel was actually a high-end escort, a professional actress they had hired from a very exclusive agency in Los Angeles. They paid her a small fortune to play the role of the perfect, loving partner. The aggressive cancer diagnosis, the agonizing hospital visits, the tears she shed holding my hand, all of it was a meticulously written script. They had invented the entire tragedy for one single purpose. They needed a compelling reason for me to unlock my personal wealth and create that massive $15 million charity fund. They had used my deepest capacity for love and empathy as a weapon to completely destroy me. They had turned my grief into a highly profitable business model. Diane stood beside my son, wrapping her arm around his waist, her face glowing with dark pride at their brilliant, wicked scheme. She told me to sign the papers and get it over with, promising that the orderlies waiting in the ambulance outside would be gentle if I did not put up a physical fight. I looked at the two monsters standing in my study. I swallowed the absolute burning disgust rising in my throat. I looked back down at the final page of the asset transfer agreement. The dotted line waited for my authorization. I pressed the tip of the pen against the paper. I let out one final shaky breath, and I signed my complete legal name. I watched the dark blue ink sink into the page. Derek immediately snatched the documents off the desk, holding them up to the morning light, as if he had just captured the Holy Grail. He let out a loud, victorious cheer, hugging Diane tightly. They believed they had just won the ultimate victory. They believed my signature had officially transferred complete control of the company into their greedy hands. But they were completely blind to the corporate reality of what had just occurred. 20 years ago, when I first took my logistics company public, I anticipated the possibility of a hostile takeover. I had my lawyers draft a highly classified corporate mechanism, a legal trapdoor hidden deep within the foundational bylaws of the organization. It was known as a poison pill clause. My signature on that specific transfer document did not grant Derek control. Instead, it instantly triggered a catastrophic corporate defense protocol. By signing under extreme duress without a mandatory board vote, I had legally activated a mechanism that automatically dissolved the entire executive hierarchy, immediately freezing every single corporate asset worldwide and transferring absolute voting power directly to a secure external trust that I solely controlled. They marched out of my study without looking back, completely intoxicated by their perceived victory. I remained seated in my heavy leather chair, listening intently to their rapid footsteps echoing down the grand hallway. The heavy thud of the front door closing behind them signaled the end of their presence in my home. They were leaving the estate for the final time, convinced they had won. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket and dialed Victor immediately. I told him they had taken the bait. The corporate poison pill was fully active, and the targets were officially on the move. Victor confirmed that the tracking beacon inside Derek Rowe's gold watch was moving rapidly down the interstate highway. Their destination was exactly what we anticipated. They were heading straight toward the executive private airstrip on the remote outskirts of the city, where a chartered jet was waiting to fly them far away from federal jurisdiction. I told Victor to assemble the team. I walked out of my study, bypassed the shattered antique vase still resting on the floor in the living room, and headed out to the main garage. I did not take the electric sedan. I walked past the luxury vehicles and climbed into the driver's seat of my old Ford truck. The heavy engine roared to life, violently shaking the rusted metal frame. I pulled out of the estate gates, aggressively following the digital trail of my treacherous family. The drive to the private airstrip took 45 tense minutes. I kept a very safe distance, allowing Victor and his highly trained team of federal contacts to position themselves discreetly around the entire perimeter of the tarmac. The morning sun was climbing higher into the sky, bathing the barren Texas landscape in a bright, unforgiving light. As I pulled my dusty truck behind a long row of empty hangars, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the sleek white jet resting on the black asphalt. The boarding stairs were already lowered, and the massive jet engines were whining with a low, powerful hum, preparing for an immediate international departure. A black luxury vehicle sped through the front security gates and screeched to a sudden halt right next to the aircraft. Diane and Derek stepped out onto the sunlit tarmac. They did not look like desperate criminals fleeing a massive corporate heist. They looked like royalty embarking on a grand, luxurious vacation. Diane was laughing loudly, her face flushed with absolute triumph, while Derek barked confident orders at the ground crew to carefully load their expensive leather luggage into the cargo hold. I watched them walk up the metal stairs, completely unaware that a swarm of federal agents was silently closing the invisible net around the entire airfield. Victor had brilliantly patched the audio feed from Derek Watch directly into my phone, allowing me to listen to every single word spoken inside the luxurious cabin of the private jet. I sat in the cab of my truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, listening to the sickening sounds of their celebration. As Derek and Diane stepped into the main cabin, a familiar female voice greeted them with a loud, excited cheer. It was Rachel, the woman whose expensive funeral I had paid for, the woman whose empty grave I had wept over, was standing right there in the aisle of a private plane, looking healthier and more radiant than ever before. She was wearing a stunning designer silk dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and she was holding a heavy bottle of highly expensive vintage champagne. I listened as the cork popped with a loud, festive bang, followed immediately by the sharp clinking of crystal flutes. Rachel laughed brightly, asking Derek if the stubborn old man had finally cracked under the pressure. Derek boasted with absolute arrogance, claiming that I had folded like a cheap suit and signed over the entire logistics empire without putting up a real fight. Diane chimed in, her voice dripping with pure malice, mocking my trembling hands and my pathetic, broken expression. They raised their glasses in a joyous toast, their voices blending together in a chorus of absolute greed. They toasted to the $50 million they firmly believed was sitting safely in the offshore bank account. They toasted to their brilliant, flawless 10-year deception. They toasted to the fake cancer, the empty grave, and the profound stupidity of a grieving father. They spoke excitedly about the massive new mansion they were going to build right on the beautiful beach, the luxury boats they were going to buy, and the absolute freedom they had finally achieved. They genuinely believed they were completely untouchable. They thought the clear blue sky above them was the only limit to their massive stolen fortune. I sat in the quiet cab of my old truck, listening to the people I once loved celebrate my total destruction. The anger that had been simmering inside my chest for days finally hardened into cold, unbreakable steel. I opened the heavy metal door of my truck and stepped out onto the warm asphalt. Victor emerged from the dark shadows of the adjacent hangar, walking in perfect, confident stride right next to Bradley, my ruthless corporate attorney. Behind them, two unmarked black vehicles rolled silently onto the tarmac, filled to the brim with armed federal agents ready to execute the final raid. It was time to board the plane and end this horrific nightmare forever. I adjusted my dark silk tie and slowly buttoned my charcoal suit jacket. I did not feel any fear, and I certainly did not feel any lingering sorrow. I only felt a profound sense of absolute justice waiting to be delivered. The three of us walked very purposefully across the hot asphalt, our footsteps marching in perfect unison toward the waiting aircraft. The grand finale of their sickening play had finally arrived, and I was about to completely rewrite their entire script. The piercing wail of police sirens suddenly shattered the morning air, echoing violently across the tarmac. The joyous laughter ringing from inside the luxurious cabin of the private jet was instantly cut short, replaced by a sudden, heavy silence. Through the small windows of the aircraft, I could see the sudden flash of red and blue lights reflecting against the pristine white fuselage. The ground crew, who had just finished loading the last of their expensive leather luggage, immediately scattered, dropping their equipment as unmarked black federal vehicles swarmed the perimeter of the aircraft. The screeching tires and the sheer volume of the approaching convoy made it incredibly clear that this was not a routine runway inspection. I stood at the bottom of the metal boarding stairs, flanked by Victor and my corporate attorney, Bradley. 24 heavily armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles, moving with terrifying precision to secure the entire airfield. They formed a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the aircraft, cutting off any possible avenue of escape. The roar of the jet engines, which had been winding up for an immediate international departure, suddenly pitched down and died out completely as federal authorities radioed the control tower to revoke their flight clearance. Inside the cabin, panic was rapidly setting in. I could hear the muffled, frantic voices of my son and my wife trying to understand what was happening outside. They assumed it was a mistake, a random inspection, or perhaps an issue with their flight plan. They had absolutely no idea that the architect of their destruction was currently walking up the metal stairs to personally deliver their final judgment. I placed my hand on the cold metal railing and began the short climb. The heavy cabin door was still open, waiting for the pilot to board. I stepped onto the thick carpet of the threshold and paused, letting the bright Texas sunlight stream in behind me, casting a long, dark shadow down the center aisle of the plane. Diane, Derek, and Rachel were frozen in their seats. They were holding their crystal flutes of expensive vintage champagne halfway to their mouths. When they saw my face, all the blood instantly drained from their cheeks. Their eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated terror. They looked at me as if they were staring at a ghost that had just crawled out of a grave. They expected to see the pilot ready to whisk them to a tropical paradise. Instead, they saw the old man they thought they had successfully destroyed, standing tall, completely composed, and radiating a cold, calculated fury. Victor stepped into the cabin right behind me, his massive frame blocking the only exit. He casually flashed his private investigator credentials, followed immediately by 2 federal agents who unholstered their weapons and aimed them at the floor. Bradley, my ruthless corporate lawyer, stepped in last, carrying a sleek silver briefcase and a very cold, satisfied smile. Derek was the first to react. His mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish pulled from the water, but no sound came out. He dropped his crystal flute. It hit the floor, shattering into pieces, the expensive champagne soaking into the pristine white carpet. Diane pressed her back against the luxurious leather seat, her chest heaving rapidly as she struggled to draw breath. Rachel simply stared, her perfectly styled blonde hair framing a face twisted in complete shock. The vibrant, triumphant atmosphere of their celebration had been completely annihilated in less than 10 seconds. I walked slowly down the aisle, my leather shoes crunching over the broken glass. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or scream. The quiet, methodical nature of my approach was far more terrifying to them than any violent outburst could ever be. I stopped right next to the luxurious leather seat where my wife was sitting. She looked up at me, her lips trembling, desperately trying to formulate a lie, an excuse, or another tearful performance. But there was nowhere left to hide. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a slim digital tablet. The screen was glowing brightly, displaying a highly secure international banking portal. I did not say a single word to her. I simply tossed the tablet into her lap. It landed softly against the expensive fabric of her black silk dress. Diane hesitated for a second, her hands shaking violently, before she slowly looked down at the illuminated screen. Derek leaned over from across the aisle, his eyes darting frantically to read the digital numbers displayed on the device. It was the direct financial portal for the anonymous offshore bank account they had established in the Grand Cayman Islands. It was the exact destination where they thought they had safely transferred the entire liquid cash reserve of my logistics empire. I watched their eyes scan the screen, searching for the massive fortune they had stolen from me. They were looking for $50 million. Instead, the bold, black numbers on the screen told a completely different story. The available balance read exactly $0 and 0 cents. The account was completely empty. Derek let out a sharp, breathless gasp. He grabbed the tablet from his mother, tapping the screen frantically, repeatedly refreshing the secure banking page as if a glitch hid his stolen wealth. He looked up at me, his face twisted in desperate confusion, demanding to know where the money was. Bradley stepped forward, his voice dripping with professional arrogance. He calmly explained the routing trap we had orchestrated in the middle of the night. He told Derek that while the transfer successfully left the corporate accounts, It never reached the sunny beaches of the Caribbean. He explained that he intercepted the authorization and rerouted the entire sum into a frozen holding account managed by the Internal Revenue Service. The stolen money was securely locked inside a federal vault under the classification of active wire fraud evidence. Derek stared at the lawyer, his mouth hanging open in complete disbelief. He aggressively shook his head, frantically tapping the screen of the tablet again and again, as if his sheer willpower could somehow summon the missing $50 million back into existence. He screamed that it was impossible, claiming that he had used my personal emergency authorization codes to secure the transfer perfectly. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, demanding that I call the bank and reverse the transaction immediately. He still thought he possessed some sort of leverage over me. He thought the threat of the corrupt psychiatrist and the waiting ambulance still held me hostage. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out the small plastic burner phone. I looked at my son, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, profound emptiness where my fatherly love used to reside. I told him that Dr. Thorne was currently sitting in the back of an unmarked federal vehicle, thoroughly cooperating with authorities in exchange for a slightly reduced prison sentence. The last shred of Derek's arrogant confidence completely vanished. Diane let out a low, agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands, as the inescapable reality of their situation finally crushed her. But I was not finished dismantling them. I pressed a single button on my burner phone, linking it via Bluetooth to the expensive surround sound system built directly into the luxurious cabin of the private jet. I told them that if they were going to spend the rest of their miserable lives in federal prison, they needed to fully understand exactly how they got caught. The high-definition video displayed the dimly lit hallway outside my master suite. Diane watched herself on the screen, her face contorting in sheer terror as she witnessed the playback of her own horrific crime. The video clearly showed her and Derek desperately dragging the massive, foaming body of the poisoned security guard toward the service elevator. I calmly explained that the man survived, thanks to a rapid medical intervention coordinated by Victor, and was currently providing a full, detailed statement to federal investigators regarding the lethal sedative Diane had explicitly instructed him to give me. The realization that they were now facing charges for attempted murder completely broke them. The unified front they had maintained for 10 years instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. The instinct for pure self-preservation violently took over. Rachel was the first to snap. She jumped up from her luxurious seat, nearly tripping over the broken champagne flute. She desperately raised her hands in the air, backing away from Derek and Diane as if they were suddenly covered in a highly contagious disease. She turned toward the federal agents standing by the door, her voice shrill and panicked. She screamed that she had absolutely nothing to do with the poisoned glass or the stolen $50 million. She cried out that she was just an actress, a hired contractor following their sick script. She aggressively pointed her finger right at Derek, eagerly volunteering to testify against both of them in court if the government would grant her full legal immunity. Diane's head snapped up. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying just moments ago, suddenly burned with a feral, unhinged rage. The woman who had meticulously maintained a facade of elegant sophistication for over a decade completely lost her mind. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream and lunged across the narrow aisle of the aircraft. She tackled Rachel with astonishing physical force, driving her backward toward the open cabin door. The two women tumbled violently out of the aircraft, falling heavily down the metal boarding stairs and crashing onto the hard, hot asphalt of the tarmac below. Diane viciously attacked the younger woman, her hands clawing desperately at Rachel's face and tearing at her expensive designer silk dress. She screamed that Rachel was an ungrateful parasite who had ruined their flawless plan. Rachel fought back wildly, pulling a handful of Diane's carefully styled hair and shrieking for help. The federal agents did not hesitate. A swarm of men in dark tactical gear immediately descended upon the violent struggle on the tarmac. They aggressively pulled the screaming women apart, forcing them face down onto the burning black asphalt. The loud, sharp clicks of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around their wrists echoed clearly through the morning air. Inside the cabin, Victor grabbed Derek by the collar of his expensive dress shirt. My son did not fight back. He simply went completely limp, sobbing hysterically like a broken child as Victor slammed him roughly against the cabin wall and locked his wrists securely behind his back. The lead federal agent stepped forward, raising his voice over the chaotic screaming outside. He formally read them their Miranda rights, clearly listing the devastating federal charges they were now facing. They were officially under arrest for massive corporate wire fraud, criminal conspiracy to fake a death, and the attempted murder of me. Their dream died. Exactly 1 month later, I stood on the edge of the sprawling front lawn, holding a simple paper cup filled with bitter black coffee. The crisp morning air bit at my face, but I barely felt the cold. I was simply watching the massive yellow bulldozers tear into the grand facade of my estate. The heavy steel claws of the machines ripped through the expensive mahogany doors, completely shattering the custom stained glass windows and pulling down the high vaulted ceilings of the living room. The deafening roar of the diesel engines echoed across the property, a beautiful, violent symphony of absolute destruction. Some of my corporate colleagues thought I was entirely insane for demolishing a property worth millions of dollars. They told me I could simply sell it, or renovate the interior to erase the bad memories. But they did not understand the profound depth of the betrayal that had occurred within those walls. That mansion was not a home anymore. It was a towering monument to a decade of sickening lies, manipulation, and pure greed. Every single marble tile and crystal chandelier was tainted by the presence of the people who had tried to bury me alive. I needed to watch it fall. I needed to see it turned into nothing but a pile of shattered wood and broken concrete, so the earth could finally be wiped clean. As a large section of the master suite collapsed into a cloud of thick white dust, I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bitter taste grounded me in the present reality, a reality where I was completely free. The federal authorities had moved swiftly and without mercy. Diane, Derek, and Rachel were currently sitting in separate, heavily guarded federal detention centers, desperately waiting for their criminal trials to begin. The fragile alliance they had built on greed completely disintegrated the moment the prison doors locked behind them. They were actively turning on each other, offering to testify against one another in pathetic attempts to secure lenient plea deals from the relentless federal prosecutors. Dr. Thorne was also behind bars, his medical license permanently revoked, his luxury yacht seized by the government, and his reputation completely destroyed. The routing trap Bradley set had worked perfectly. The $50 million was securely recovered by the authorities and safely returned to the corporate operating accounts long before the public ever knew it was missing. With the immediate threat neutralized, I had my legal team quickly reverse the poison pill mechanism. The company stabilized instantly. Just 2 weeks ago, we successfully launched the initial public offering on the stock exchange. The market response was absolutely staggering. Investors saw a resilient, heavily fortified logistics empire led by a man who had weathered every conceivable storm. The capital raised exceeded our most optimistic projections by hundreds of millions of dollars. My legacy was secure, stronger than it had ever been. But the money did not mean the same thing to me anymore. Wealth was a tool, and I had learned the hard way how easily that tool could be twisted into a weapon by the wrong hands. I did not need another mansion, and I certainly did not need another fake family. I decided to take the entire $15 million sum from the fraudulent charity fund and completely repurpose it. I established a genuine foundation, overseen by an independent board of ruthless auditors to ensure every single penny went exactly where it belonged. We are currently breaking ground on a massive state-of-the-art orphanage right here in the heart of Texas. It will be a sanctuary for children who have been abandoned, abused, or forgotten by the very people who were supposed to protect them. I wanted to build a place where genuine care and absolute safety were guaranteed, a place untouched by the toxic greed I had allowed into my own life. I spent 73 years building a corporate empire, but this new foundation will be the only legacy I truly leave behind. The heavy bulldozers pushed the last standing wall of my former study to the ground. A massive plume of dust rose into the bright morning sky, catching the golden light of the rising sun. The demolition was complete. The estate was completely gone, leaving only a flat, empty expanse of dirt. I threw my empty coffee cup into a nearby trash bin and turned away from the wreckage. I walked across the driveway toward the only vehicle I had chosen to keep from my old life. The rusted, dented frame of my old Ford truck sat proudly in the morning sunlight. I opened the heavy metal door, listening to the familiar, comforting squeak of the hinges. I climbed into the worn driver's seat, surrounded by the faint, honest smells of old engine oil and worn leather. I inserted the key into the ignition. The old engine coughed for a second, before roaring to life with a steady, reliable rhythm. I placed my hands on the steering wheel, feeling the rough texture against my palms. I was 73 years old, sitting alone in a beaten-down truck, but I had never felt more powerful, more dignified, or more entirely free. I shifted the truck into gear and drove slowly down the long driveway, leaving the dust and the ruins of my past far behind me. The road ahead was completely open, stretching out toward the horizon under a beautiful, clear blue sky. I rolled down the driver's side window, allowing the cool morning breeze to wash over my face. For the first time in a decade, I was not looking over my shoulder. I was only looking forward. A brand new chapter of my life was just beginning today. Blood doesn't make you family. Loyalty does. I learned that the hard way, so you don't have to. What would you have done in my shoes? Tell me which city you're watching from in the comments below.